Liar! Yes!
He is not an abusive man, but a wealthy businessman driven to hatred by love, and a legendary hopeless romantic. As early as half a year ago, this man who never believed in love, in order to continue his family lineage, selected a foreign bride for himself. But when he met the woman he had been corresponding with for 2 months, the appearance of his fiancée was completely different from the photo in his hand. The fiancée explained that she disliked shallow men who judge by looks, so she had sent someone else's photo in advance. Seeing her fair skin like snow, lips as delicate as cream, and eyes shimmering like autumn water, the man fell for her at first sight. The man's name was Luis, a coffee import and export merchant. The fiancée Julia crossed the ocean to meet him, and they felt as if they had met too late, holding a grand wedding the very next day. However, amid the blessings of friends and family, their whirlwind marriage still felt somewhat unfamiliar, but Luis told her they could fall in love after marriage, and he would never force Julia to become his wife before she was ready. On their wedding night, they slept in separate rooms. What Julia did not expect was that Luis owned vast fertile lands and was surrounded by numerous servants, and the estate they lived in was like a magnificent palace. Every day, Julia was awakened by Luis's gentle whispers. The newly married Luis put aside all his work and took her horseback riding every day, showing her the coffee plantations of the Tarman family. Julia felt extremely happy, but in every conversation, a trace of unfathomable sadness always flickered in Julia's eyes. It was precisely this sense of mystery that ignited even more passion in Luis's heart. Unable to restrain his affection for Julia, on the 3rd day after their marriage, their love burned intensely, and they naturally became a true couple. One day, Luis took Julia to watch a stage play. During the intermission, Julia said she wanted to go to the restroom. The wife of a friend sitting nearby immediately noticed that Julia seemed a bit flustered.
She suffers from a little too much rouge.
Nonsense. A lady does not wear rouge.
No, a lady doesn't. And a lady does not wander through the theater alone either.
Sure enough, Julia did not return for a long time after leaving. Luis got up and searched everywhere, eventually spotting Julia backstage at the theater. There, he saw a strange man behaving intimately with her. Just as Luis was about to approach and find out the truth, the theater manager suddenly pulled down the curtain and warned him to stay away from backstage. At the same time, Julia also noticed Luis.
Who was the man?
Under Julia's sweet and affectionate advances, Luis gradually dismissed the doubts in his heart. After returning home, Julia received a letter from the United States. In the letter, Julia's sister expressed concern about her married life and kept urging her to write back to let the family know she was safe. Luis also suggested that Julia should immediately write a reply, but several days passed, and Luis still did not see Julia pick up a pen. In order to help his wife reconnect with her family, Luis urged Julia to write a letter home and personally mailed it for her. But ever since that letter was sent, Julia would wake up from nightmares every night. Luis assumed she had not yet adjusted to her new life, and each time he gently comforted her, only going to sleep after she had calmed down. By chance, Luis discovered that Julia's back was covered with many old knife scars. He thought his wife must have gone through many painful experiences, and with that thought, he cherished her even more. To make it easier for his wife to spend money, Luis took Julia to the bank the next day and had her sign a document that allowed her to withdraw funds freely. After learning about this, a friend warned Luis that such a move was too reckless.
Love someone is to give and then want to give more.
Both. I want to give her everything. And I want to take everything from her.
Oh, Luis, you are a lost man.
Just as Luis was leaving his friend's company, a man claiming to be a private detective sent by Julia's sister approached him. The detective told Luis that since they had not heard from Julia for a long time, her family had sent him to find out her whereabouts. Hearing that he was from his wife's family, Luis sincerely invited the detective to visit the estate the next day. That afternoon, when Luis returned home, he noticed a strong smell of cigarette smoke on Julia. Even though he had never seen her smoke, Julia explained that she wanted Luis's sin to stay with her all day. This explanation made Luis overjoyed, as he felt deeply needed. While they were bathing, the pet bird in the bedroom kept chirping noisily, and Julia became extremely irritated, constantly complaining to Luis. The next day, a maid discovered that the little bird had died in its cage. Luis could not help but feel a chill in his heart as he looked at his seemingly harmless wife. What happened next pulled Luis straight into an abyss. One day, a strange woman burst into Luis's office, and she looked extremely anxious.
My name is Russell. I am Julia's sister. So, you will understand how upset I was to receive this letter.
Upset?
Which was written in answer to the one I last sent her, and which is signed in her name, is not from Julia.
It was clear that the sister the woman spoke of was not the Julia by Luis's side. She had used some method to take the place of the woman in the photograph and had come to Luis's side. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, Luis immediately rushed back home at full speed. But by then, Julia had already disappeared, leaving behind only a small knife and their wedding ring. Luis opened the suitcase Julia had brought with her and, after inspecting it, became even more certain that she had impersonated someone else and approached him with a plan and a hidden motive. Luis questioned the nanny.
She's not coming back.
She never was here.
Sitting collapsed on the ground, Luis suddenly thought of something, mounted his horse again, and rushed to the bank to check the account assets.
Your wife appeared at 5 minutes to 3 for a last-minute withdrawal. Your balance at closing time was 51 American dollars and 40 cents in the one account, $10 in the other.
For a long time afterward, Luis fell into a state of deep despair, numbing himself with alcohol every day. But the more he did so, the more painful it became. He had loved Julia so deeply, and it was the first time he had ever believed in love, and this outcome dragged him into a bottomless pit of suffering. One day, while drowning his sorrows in a pleasure house, Luis ran into the same private detective who had approached him before. Luis wanted to make a deal with him, to find Julia no matter what, but the detective told him,
"What could you possibly want with her? What could you possibly want?"
I want to kill her.
From Captain Coldu, they learned that Julia and a group of actors had taken their ship from the United States to Cuba 3 months earlier. At the same time, a waiter recognized the real Julia from the photograph, describing her as young, gentle, and very kind. Someone who would pack food at breakfast every day to feed the pet bird she carried with her, but she had mysteriously disappeared before they reached shore. Another woman also confirmed that the Julia who fled with the money had been on the same ship. Not long after, Luis and the detective arrived in the United States. As soon as they checked into the hotel room, the detective secretly swapped out the handgun in Luis's suitcase. During dinner, Luis was eating in the hotel restaurant when he heard a familiar laugh behind him. He turned around and saw his missing wife flirting intimately with an old man. It was obvious that Julia was a professional con artist, and the old man was her new target. Luis did not alert her, and after obtaining Julia's room number from the lobby manager, he returned to his room to retrieve his weapon. Meanwhile, Julia used her usual tricks to gradually seduce the older man. When the man made an improper advance, Julia pushed him out of the room to build anticipation, and no matter how he begged at the door, she continued to play coy. Back in her room, she picked up a pen and wrote a love letter to another lover.
It's only me, Julia.
What are your plans for me?
I just came here to kill you. Oh, like the woman you murdered.
I was not alone.
She told you all about me, didn't she?
No! And he came to me the next morning and told me that she had met with an accident.
Another man? Why not? Why not?
I was falling in love with my own husband.
Liar!
Yes!
Julia's tearful confession of love instantly extinguished Luis's anger. Loving someone can strip away the ability to tell right from wrong. The man who swore just yesterday to end her life became inseparable from her after a single night of intimacy. Julia explained that the man she had grown up with was actually the one she trusted most from the orphanage. They were once lovers, and he was also her only family. Luis did not care about Julia's past. As long as she was determined to change in the future, he was willing to forgive everything and love her as always. Luis took out the wedding ring and placed it back on Julia's finger. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. The old man, completely enchanted by Julia, had come early in the morning, eager to see the woman he adored. He did not expect to find Luis standing there instead. Julia wrapped her arms around Luis intimately, and the old man took the hint and quietly left. The next morning, Luis had breakfast with the detective. In the newspaper, Luis noticed a headline published by the authorities, stating that the body of the real Julia, who had died mysteriously months earlier, had been found on a beach. The report stated that the victim's throat had been cut with a sharp knife, and the blade had lodged in her throat, causing her to suffocate. Luis immediately thought of the small knife in his wife's suitcase. The detective said that this impostor Julia had already been listed as a wanted fugitive by the police. Hearing this, Luis concealed the fact that he had found Julia. The moment he turned away, he took Julia and fled the hotel. Julia had no idea that the man before her loved her to the point of madness. They arrived at a remote port town, where Luis planned to buy a new house and spend the rest of his life with Julia. The town was simple and isolated, and Luis believed that no one would disturb their new life. But their happiness lasted only a few days before the persistent detective appeared before Luis once again. He would occasionally glance toward the balcony of Luis's home, as if searching for something. When Julia saw him, her expression became complicated, as if she was afraid, yet also conflicted, leaving much to be interpreted. Using an excuse to leave the detective, Luis hurried home, frantically gathering all the cash and taking out a handgun, intending to flee again with Julia. But as he called out his wife's name again and again, there was no response. Just as he was about to go downstairs to continue searching, the detective suddenly followed him up.
Where is she?
Please, be smart and leave. You are aiding a criminal. You saw it. She is not here now, please.
Don't lie to me, Mr. Vargas. I can smell her on you.
Just as their argument grew heated, Julia suddenly rushed in to protect his wife. Luis fired a shot at the detective. Seeing the detective lying motionless on the ground, Luis instantly panicked, but Julia showed no fear at all, calmly comforting Luis as they began to clean up the scene together. Next, Julia told Luis to go to the train station to buy tickets. After sending Luis away, she walked over to the detective and ripped off his beard. It turned out that the detective was actually Julia's lover, Billy. He had already swapped Luis's handgun. For a long time, they had been a perfect con artist duo, but Billy was not satisfied with the cash Julia had taken from Luis. He had bigger plans.
He's worth a hell of a lot more than we got out of him the first time, darling. And he's such an easy mark, devoted as he is to you.
At this point, however, Julia seemed to have truly fallen in love with Luis. When it came to taking Luis's life, she found herself unable to go through with it. She also understood that she was nothing more than a pawn for making money in Billy's eyes, and that he never truly loved her. After returning from the train station, Luis told Julia that their money had run out, and that the next morning he would have to go to Santiago to convert family stocks into cash for their escape. In the middle of the night, Julia woke up from a nightmare. Not wanting Luis to risk his life for her, she begged him not to go to Santiago, saying she had other ways to make money. It turned out that Julia planned to return to her old tricks to make a fortune. She took Luis to a casino, using pre-arranged body signals to win big at the gambling table. However, due to Luis's lack of skill, Julia's signals were eventually noticed. Luis was beaten by casino staff for cheating, while Julia was intercepted by other players and humiliated in a room. To keep Julia alive, Luis even turned against an old friend. He went to his friend's bank, broke open a safe illegally, stole a large amount of cash, and prepared to go back and find Julia again. But while he was gathering funds back in Cuba, Julia was entangled with Billy once more. The knife scars on Julia's back were in fact Billy's so-called punishment of love. After a long journey, Luis returned to Julia's side and noticed something unusual about her. Julia would often get up in the middle of the night and secretly go to a hidden place. When Luis followed her there, he witnessed an unbelievable scene. The Billy he had supposedly shot was miraculously alive, and he was together with his wife.
Or I promise you, it will kill you.
Hearing their conversation, Luis felt as if struck by lightning. He did not confront them immediately, but returned home and demanded an explanation from Julia. Yet Julia remained as calm and indifferent as ever, which left him utterly disappointed. Watching Julia prepare coffee for him, Luis felt a sense of confusion. What he did not know was that the coffee contained an unknown powder. Unable to get the answers he wanted, Luis decided to confront her directly.
From the moment I met you, do you laugh at me behind my back, the two of you?
No.
Laugh now when I tell you this. I loved you, Julia.
Julia is not here. Julia is dead.
When I tell you that I still love you.
No. No, not me. You don't love me.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. You, as you are. Good and bad. Better and worse.
To prove his love, Luis picked up the cup and drank the coffee. At that moment, the lights in the room dimmed, signaling the beginning of the plan Julia and Billy had agreed upon. But Julia was moved by Luis's actions, and out of guilt, she did not stay behind to wait for Billy. Fortunately, the amount Luis had consumed was not enough to take his life. Julia hurriedly supported Luis and ran toward the train station. Billy chased after them. What Billy did not expect was that Luis's gun had been loaded with real bullets. Just as the police rushed over after hearing the gunshots, Julia snatched the gun from Luis's hand. She did not want Luis to go to prison because of her, and then fired another shot at Billy, making sure he was truly dead. Only then did she beg the police to call an ambulance and take Luis to the hospital. Soon after, Julia was arrested and detained by the police for taking 2 lives. The court ultimately sentenced her to death. During routine end-of-life care in prison, Julia told the priest everything she had experienced since childhood. Julia asked the priest whether someone like her could be forgiven by God. If human nature is inherently flawed and life is a process of atonement, the priest suggested that they pray together. During the prayer, Julia secretly opened her eyes, revealing a sly and seductive smile. The next day was the day of the execution. When the officers came to take the prisoner, they discovered that the person facing away from them was not Julia. The priest was wearing Julia's robe, and with his help, Julia had already escaped. No one knew what had happened that night. Half a year later, in a casino in Morocco, North Africa, Luis sat with his gambler friends, telling the story of his love.